Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to resume so that we can keep this the show on time. With a lot of pleasure that I get to introduce this panel. Starting on the far right, Jared Russell, who's a former British diplomat with 14 years experience in the diplomatic corps, served in Kabul, served in Iraq, speaks Arabic and Dari, was the British government's point person for outreach to the Muslim world, essentially set up that program. He's at the Carr Center at Harvard's Kennedy School, who is one of the co-hosts of this event, along with Mike Semple. His colleague is here and will speak later. And then next to Jared, we have Masood Aziz, who's a distinguished former diplomat here in the Afghan embassy in Washington, a diplomat who speaks English, French, and Dari, who is educated in France, has a business background, an MBA, and is done a lot of work on the whole issue of the New Silk Road and has a book on that subject recently published. And then my friend, colleague, and boss to his left, Steve Cole, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, was nominated for another Pulitzer for the recent Bin Laden book he wrote, has been reporting on South Asia for more than 2 decades, has written some of the most important works of journalism at his job at The New Yorker on the issues of what a peace agreement between Pakistan and India might look like, how close they came to that under Musharraf, why that didn't happen, and what better panel to really look at some of the regional players in South Asia. And we're going to start with Steve.
So thank you, Peter. I'm going to try to be brief, in part because the subject of my talk was the subject of Ambassador Singh's address, and it's a little bit odd to sort of annotate the Deputy Chief of Missions version of India's strategic outlook, but that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the journalist prerogative to read between the lines and do just a little bit of margin note-taking about India's relationship with its neighbors, particularly looking forward. And I think it's worth starting with just a little bit of reflection on what the India is that is rethinking its strategy in South Asia. When Ambassador Singh entered the Foreign Service in 1979, it really was the Foreign Service that thought deeply and almost had a monopoly on strategy. And after the Cold War, Indian politics and the nature of decision-making in the Indian elites has been changing very rapidly in ways that are fascinating, mostly constructive. But it sort of started with the rise of the BJP as a national contender for power and the donor base, essentially, in the campaign cycle coming out of the merchant classes and the business classes in the big cities, having a different conversation with their elected politicians about where the country's interests really lie looking forward, and helping essentially to educate a generation of elected political leaders in India about globalization, about the Indian diaspora, about where India's rise was really going to be located. And so what you see now is that the nature of decision-making in the Indian elites is much broader, more complicated, and to some extent, you could say that there has been a narrative from 1992 to the present where there was a lot of competition and sort of volatility in that internal discourse, to a point now where I think there is a reasonable consensus expressed in Ambassador Singh's speech about where India's interests lie in the region. And so let me kind of annotate that. He was quite explicit about most of it. The first thing to start in a more sort of realist's framework, India needs energy. If India is going to continue to grow at this pace, it needs power generation, most of all. It also needs transportation fuel. It needs to be able to manufacture chemicals and other industrial products. And really, when you look at the energy environment around India, net importer already, the most striking feature of the region from an Indian perspective is all this stranded natural gas in Central Asia and Iran. Iran, essentially for power generation, it's all about natural gas, and most of the world's supplies are a land route away from India. the largest supplies in the world are in Russia, Iran, and Qatar. The only problem is you can't finance a pipe from any of those places to India because you've got to run through Afghanistan and Pakistan. So, apart from strategic altruism, there is the strategic imperative of having enough energy to grow over the next 20 or 30 years and compete with China. Now, the Chinese have exactly the same vision. They have domestic coal supplies and other things. They have basically the same geostrategic equation, but they can stick their straw under Russia, to coin a phrase from a movie that some of you might have seen, without having to run through Afghanistan or Pakistan. And they can stick their straw under Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan without the same kind of complication. So it is fundamentally in the interests of India to get this corridor sorted out. Now, there's a much broader benefit which the ambassador, I think, tried to articulate, which is, of course, stability, shared economic growth, the benefits that flow from not just trade but middle-class formation and pluralism in the region. And though it's too reductive, I sometimes think of India's position as it tries to make choices about its interests in this area as analogous to where the United States was in the second half of the 20th century thinking about the Americas. Because during the Cold War, the United States was certainly tempted by a vision of regional policy in which the enemy of our global enemy was our friend and everything else was way down the list. And even before the Cold War ended, but particularly after the Cold War, it was possible then to evolve a vision of shared prosperity and open borders and an integrated region and a commitment to shared political systems that emphasized pluralism and inclusiveness. But it was a long way to get there, and we still have residual subjects like Cuba that we can't quite shake off. And I think if you consider where India is in its relationship with Pakistan in particular, and the bloody history of those countries' birth as independent nations, it's very early to expect this fragile consensus that's formed at the top of the Indian political system that holds, as the Prime Minister says, as Ambassador Singh said, that holds that a stable, modernizing, democratic Pakistan is in India's national interest. It's early in the engineering of that conviction into policy. But I do think India's interests as well as its political culture will lead us there. Let me just say very quickly something about the specific project of normalization of relations between India and Pakistan. Ambassador Singh described India's declaratory policy at the moment, which is that in principle India would welcome normalization, but the talks to achieve it are delayed at present because of the persistence of Pakistan's support for terrorist groups as India perceives it. Now, in the spring of 2007, the governments of India and Pakistan came very close to announcing a comprehensive agreement that would not have provided resolution of every dispute between them, but would have provided a Oslo or Madrid level framework breakthrough to basically every territorial dispute between them, including Kashmir. Some things have been solved, Sir Creek. Some things were 90% solved, like Siachen. And there was a framework agreement on Kashmir that essentially embraced Prime Minister Singh's vision of a borderless world. Now, it's true that fell apart because President Musharraf lost his grip on power and the Red Mosque and political violence descended in Pakistan and a lot of other factors. But I think it's important to note the Indian conditionality about Pakistan's performance against terrorism, because it was present then too. It's not just tacked on. It's actually, I would argue in defense of India's declaratory policy, necessary both for Indian domestic politics and for holding together the consensus, including the BJP, that the risks of such a deal are worth it. Because what Pakistan delivered in 2006 was measurable quietude along the line of control. So by the time you got to the final set of negotiations in the first quarter of 2007, the one thing that India could see was infiltrations out of Azad Kashmir, to use the Pakistani phrase, into Indian-held Kashmir. And the Pakistan Army had delivered virtually a zero rate of infiltration, precisely for the purpose of building confidence for the negotiations. And there were back-channel talks where people would put up PowerPoint slides and say, this is what the trend line looks like. It's down to zero. Now, the reason that was provided adequate confidence at the time, in part, was because then as now, there was this impossible empirical debate about what is Pakistani capacity actually? What is it reasonable to expect the Pakistani government to do about Lashkar-e-Taiba or the defendants in the Mumbai case or North Waziristan? Now, there are so many different ways you can cut the answer to that question, but the one place where you could measure will, intent, was along the line of control, because the security zone on the Pakistan side of the line of control is such that infiltration is in effect state policy there. I mean, and the state does have the capacity to shut it down, as it proved in 2006. Now, the metrics that India offers today to get back to that deal, to get back to that negotiation, are based on the post-Mumbai world and based on accountability for the cell and the support and the defendants in that. And we won't detain ourselves at that, but that's kind of still the obstacle today. But the rates of infiltration along the line of control are also an issue, because they're back up. They're not catastrophic, but they're significant. Very quickly, India's regional policy in Afghanistan is also informed by the prospect of a post-NATO Afghanistan, whenever that comes and whatever it means. When Ambassador Dobbins went into the Bonn 1 negotiations, he wasn't inventing a caucus around the construction of an Afghan constitutional order opposed to the Taliban. He was joining an alliance that already existed among India, Russia, and Iran primarily, also Central Asian states, Turkey. Now, that caucus is quite quietly reconsidering the possibility of its revival. It could be in catastrophic circumstances of a second civil war. It could also just be in a game of hedging that flirts with disaster but never produces it. But make no mistake, India sees its enduring regional interests as linked to the preservation of its options in that Central Asian space, not only because of the energy equation, but because of its history there. And then finally, just a word about China, because I know Masood's going to talk about it, but I just want to mention Chinese-Indian relations. My sense is that they're much more brittle than you might think. There is plenty of brittleness and struggle between the United States and India to really deliver on their shared values and their shared strategic interests and their common democratic cultures. But we're much more naturally aligned and much further along. The narrative of India-Chinese cooperation has been, in many ways, much more visible, because there's quite a lot of symmetry and emphasis on economic cooperation and shared interests in a stable, prosperous Asia. But the border disputes, the military deployments, the sense of mutual anxiety, or certainly a sense of uncertainty about Chinese intent, has created a brittleness that I think affects the way India sees all the rest of this equation. Certainly the way they see Pakistan as a potential proxy of Chinese ambitions in the region. And this question of whether China shares the vision that Ambassador Singh articulated or not, from an Indian perspective, has to be fundamental. And I don't think if I were them, I would not be confident about the answer. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Peter. I've always said that following Steve is never a good idea, because not only he has that rare combination of refined thinking and very articulate speaking, so it's all downhill, especially since I'm following him. But let me first, before starting, thanking the New America Foundation, and especially Peter and Steve for their leadership on putting this topic on the agenda, which is so critical. My talk is about the role of China in the Pakistan-Afghanistan conflict. And as soon as you bring in China in an already complex situation, you're really bringing half of the world, if not the rest of the world. So my talk is not really going to be about the broader role of China on the global stage, or the U.S. relationship with China. That deserves another day-long conference by itself. But I'll be focused specifically on the Afghanistan-Pakistan only. That broader context, of course, is critically important because we're talking about China. One of the first things that I like to do is lay to rest at least one notion today, and that is that when we talk about the U.S. Afghanistan strategy, we should really be stopping to name it an Afghanistan strategy, and begin to use other taxonomy, because ultimately it matters. This conflict cannot be resolved by calling it the Afghanistan strategy, and even just a U.S. strategy. So perhaps in honor of the conference name, maybe we can use something such as the South Asia Common Strategy. My contention today is that China is really the missing piece of this strategy, and that without China, I cannot see a way out of this conflict. The U.S. has been in Afghanistan for 9 years now, 110,000 troops, 150,000 combined NATO troops, hundreds of billions of dollars spent, no success in sight. The COIN strategy, the counterinsurgency strategy, looking at clear hold and build, we can't even get to the hold part, let alone to the building part, which could be critically important. The transfer part now about the Afghan National Army is just not even in sight, and doesn't make any sense if you look at the endpoints either. So how is it that we are going to look into that? The heart of the matter in terms of this conflict is really something else, isn't it? To solve for Afghanistan, you really have to look at the entire region, not at Afghanistan. And we have patted ourselves in the back after 9/11 and found the holy grail by saying that really it's all about non-state players, that we have to focus on them, Al-Qaeda without a territory, even the Taliban without a territory, that we have really gone, in fact, in my view, in the wrong path around that issue, and devise strategies such as counterinsurgency strategy to look at local actors in Marja or Helmand, for example, look at tribal dynamics, culture and history and that sort of thing, and devise a strategy to deal with that, while the real issue of this conflict, in my view, are in fact not the non-state players, but actually the state players. The actual conflict, in my view, in the Afghanistan-Pakistan area is because of the strength of very powerful state player. This is the ultimate game, powerful regional game that we have talked about historically. So the strong states, of course, are Pakistan, or the army representing Pakistan, India, strong state, and obviously, if we're talking about a strong state, China, and the United States has been in the area. So I think that's really the important part of this. And talking about China, I will not talk about the rise of China as a global player. Everybody knows about that. Only 3 years ago, it was the fourth economy in the world. Today, it's the second already. It will overtake the U.S. economy perhaps within a couple of decades, which is to say a lot. importantly, no nation in history has had this scale and speed. This context is extremely important. Yet again, in the strategy that we're talking about, China doesn't figure anywhere in this context, and it's next door. China and Afghanistan and Pakistan. China has been involved in the conflict in a way because in the 80s, with the Soviet invasion, China was the first country providing arms to the Mujahideen via Pakistan and U.S. help. Lately, in 2008, China invested $3.5 billion in the Ainak copper mine in Afghanistan. Some say the largest unexplored copper mine in the world. But what's interesting about that is that it isn't just a mine. China, in fact, is due to develop a whole series of infrastructure projects, railroads, roads, constructions, power plants, schools. And it's only the beginning, in my view, of a larger context of these rare earth discoveries, minerals, etc. in Afghanistan. So China is already in Afghanistan from an economic development perspective. In Pakistan, it's a whole different thing. China's had a 60-year-long history with Pakistan, an alternative type of approach to what is commonly known. A close relationship with the military, with the political groups, with the intelligence. China is the principal provider of nuclear and conventional weapons to Pakistan. It is the principal arms supplier to Pakistan, and of course infrastructure building, the Gwadar port. So what are China's interests in the regions? How can we understand them in a way? Where are the links? What are the U.S. opportunities in bringing China into the realm? First of all, the Xinjiang province, the largest province in China and on the west side of China, 22 million inhabitants, almost the size of Afghanistan's inhabitants. Half of them are Muslims, the Uyghur. They have more in common with Central Asia than they do with China or the rest of China. Xinjiang borders Pakistan and Afghanistan. And rightly so, the Chinese have been concerned about cross-border flows into this region of arms, militants, and narcotics, and very concerned about the ideological influence of global jihadi groups into influencing the separatist movement of the Uyghur. So China has been pursuing for a very long time an appeasement type of strategy, policy with Pakistan, with military aid to Pakistan, as we know, and mentioned it, with economic aid, in order to keep that area in check. And in my opinion, that has been extremely effective in the past. This is a policy that has worked, at least in the past, but lately it has not. There's been violence with the Uyghur in the Xinjiang area recently in the 90s and the 2000s and last year. Separatist groups and violence with the Uyghurs related to the Xinjiang area. How long can China essentially pay its way to keep influence or public opinion or extremist opinions or even moderate opinions to influence this region? My contention is not much longer these days. You know, with cell phones now, with videos and cell phones pictures, the open society that we have now, and most importantly, China's own presence, increasing importance around the globe, including in Africa and other places in Muslim countries, make it so that they will not be able to have that region isolated. So that dynamic is changing. There's opportunities for the U.S. there. China's overall concern about extremism emanating from the region of Pakistan and Afghanistan has been such that as long as the Pakistani army, for example, had total control over extremist groups, that kind of investment from China, long-term investments with money and relationships, has paid off effectively, had good return. But for example, they're very concerned now about the Pakistani Taliban, which they understand, the army doesn't have total control over, as we understand and know. And that, in effect, changes the entire dynamic of China's investment and its relationship with Pakistan if those groups cannot be controlled. So I think, yet again, that's another opportunity here to talk about things with the U.S. Nuclear conflict. During the Mumbai attack, China intervened with shuttle diplomacy in Pakistan because they're very concerned about that. They're certainly concerned about the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and they see themselves, importantly, as an actor in a case of an Indian retaliation, as we talked about earlier today. China sees itself as being forced to intervene, either with Pakistan or against India, if there's some kind of Indian intervention. They don't want to be dragged in a conflict like that. And the possibility, as explained earlier by Bruce Rydell and others, that possibility is certainly more palpable now. China does not, and is very concerned, does not want to be drawn into that conflict. This is another opportunity. China has been victim of terrorism in Afghanistan lately, in the Faryab province, kidnapping by the Taliban, rocket attacks in the area of the Ainak copper mine, as well in 2007 in Pakistan, with the Red Mosque there, killing of engineers in Pakistan, Chinese engineers, and attacks on other Chinese convoys. There's 10,000 Chinese nationals working in Pakistan. So the U.S. strategy that needs to be really couched under a regional, the problem is a regional problem, solutions have to be such. Really, obviously, need to have the two aspects of carrots and sticks. And in a way, to begin with, the U.S. needs to have a strong presence in the broader Asia security realm to simply discourage the use of coercion by China. But at the same time, also have an active diplomatic engagement to encourage China to seek a much greater role and influence through economic development and diplomatic policies there. And, the true regional approach that is missing. But it would be a mistake, for example, for the United States to push too far the U.S.-Indian relationship if it's going to be perceived by China as encircling China or against China. And the U.S. has to be extremely sensitive to that, because that may push China to support even further Pakistan in the old way that it has been doing. So it may backfire on the U.S. The U.S. needs to be extremely sensitive to that and actually break that logjam by directly seeking alliances with China. So from that perspective, it really matters. It's also a mistake to be overly dependent on Pakistan, obviously, money without accountability, over-reliance on the supply routes that we know about, and this approach of a transactional approach with Pakistan, rather than putting on the table a big idea in the way that we've done with India for Pakistan to change Pakistan's own calculus towards India. And then finally, a failure of the U.S. and NATO in Afghanistan actually now is extremely detrimental, in my view, for China. Imagine the situation, the Taliban coming back, taking over, but it would never be in control of the entire territory. There's going to be different factions, north and south, etc., supported by external forces, Iran, Pakistan, India, Russia probably involved, and suddenly we have chaos. We have perhaps another, jihadist, global jihadist development group there that's possible. None of this is beneficial to China. And that leverage is a U.S. leverage, a NATO leverage, that could be the beginning of discussions with China. So finally, to talk about currently and post-withdrawal of the U.S. from Afghanistan, one of the things that I would propose and look into is to see how the U.S. can engage a United Nations sanctioned development program for China in Afghanistan to allow it to play a leading role on a global stage in development in Afghanistan, as it's already starting to do that by itself. But that kind of proposal cannot come from the U.S. It has to be a third party, such as France, for example. The issue of negotiating with the Taliban. Obviously, negotiating with the Taliban has to happen with Pakistan. As soon as you say that, you have to have China in the picture. We have not been discussing the issue of negotiation with the Taliban as far as I understand it. I'm raising that issue. We can't really talk about it at the moment, but hopefully we can get to it in the Q&A. Drugs, narcotics. China has the largest number of heroin users in the world. 25% of that heroin comes from Afghanistan into China from the Xinjiang area. This is another area of cooperation. The INAC copper mine development program needs security. NATO can provide that security in cooperation with China. Otherwise, it's not going to be possible. But it also can be done in the context of negotiation with Taliban groups that China wants. So China can say, no, we're not in bed with the security aspect of Afghanistan with the U.S. and NATO. We are pursuing a development program, and we'll be helping with negotiating with the Taliban. So there's an area of cooperation, as an example, related to this development portion that's practical. And then other issues, role of China in the police and civilian development. And then even for the U.S., Steve alluded to some aspect of that. The U.S. can develop the Wuhan corridor in Afghanistan that connects to China, as a border to China. It's underdeveloped, as a mechanism of opening trade routes with China and cooperating with China on this aspect. So let me just conclude then by saying that the jigsaw that I've presented that we have been discussing today, any pieces of this jigsaw, if we touch it, relate to all of the other pieces. We cannot be just working and talking about one piece only without directly affecting all these pieces. The benefit of such a partnership with China, indirectly or directly, under a UN sanction or not, is such that for the U.S., it gains the kind of leverage that it does not have with Pakistan, that China has, and it cannot obtain with Pakistan, that China already has, in a way. For Pakistan, it's strengthening its relationship with a long-time ally, China. For India, India agrees with China that stability in the region is extremely important. And perhaps this would be an opportunity not only through trade, Steve mentioned it, but also for India to gain a new level of partnership with China. And for China itself to become, as it desires now, has expressed this practically in many ways in recent years, the international player on the global stage that it really wants to have. So let me stop in here, and perhaps we can continue in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be on this panel. I said to Peter last night that in any discussion of the great game, it is conventional to have a British diplomat present. I am, of course, an ex-diplomat. And I look around the room and I wonder if there are any Russian ex-diplomats slowly moving their chair towards me. I don't mean to make light, of course, of the great game. It is a very serious matter, and it affects the welfare and lives of many millions of people. The Inspector General lost his brother. The ambassador lost a colleague and a friend of mine, Venkat Rao, in Kabul 2.5 years ago in a car bombing at the Indian embassy. So they, among the many others who have suffered from regional politics, I remember. And so often the great game has been about fear. Steve spoke very, very precisely and rightly on this point. The fear of China and India, the brittleness of their relationship. As one reads accounts from the Indian press, sometimes the Chinese press, you see fears of naval encirclement, of India being choked by a string of pearls, of the Gwadar port housing the Chinese Navy. Both countries on a trajectory where the existing natural resources of the world may not be sufficient to fuel their growth, at least so far as is known. A fear from India of being targeted by terrorists with strategic depth in Afghanistan, should everything fall apart there. A fear in Pakistan of being attacked on two fronts, should the Indian military be able to get a foothold in Baluchistan, as I saw Thomas Barfield suggested in his recent history of Afghanistan. And of course, a fear in India of Kashmiri insurgents, a fear in Pakistan of Baluchi insurgents. I believe it is possible to break out of a cycle of fear. And Masood described very well the way in which the great game or the regional politics can actually serve Afghanistan's interests and enhance its stability. First of all, as he said, China's need for copper, by 2013 projected to reach 9 million tons, 3 times the needs of the United States. And the demand already exceeds supply. And therefore the critical importance of the Anak mine, among other sources, of course. Last year, China imported 60% of the world's iron ore. Hajigak has got approximately 2 billion tons, they say, of iron ore. Again, a major source of metals and minerals for China. And on current plans, of course, it is possible for the Chinese to use the transport infrastructure of Pakistan, in which they are also investing, along the Karakoram highway down to Gwadar port. But it is a reason for them to want stability. And Pakistan does need China. I think the reasons for that have been very clearly expressed. A Chinese diplomat, according to Al Jazeera a few days ago, clearly a diplomat with something of a tin ear, I'd have to say, claimed in a phrase essentially calculated to offend everyone, that Pakistan was China's Israel. By which I suppose, seriously, he meant that it was a strategic partner of long standing, in which China is, to security, China is completely committed. Now, I just want to point out, and I want to use this map a little bit to point this out, another regional power we haven't spoken about quite so much, with a strong interest in Afghanistan, is Iran. And as Steve pointed out, the discussions have intensified between Iranian, Indian, and Russian foreign ministers in recent months in apparent response to the prospect of reintegration and reconciliation in Afghanistan. Dare I say, I don't think this is just about terrorism. This is also about the growth of Pakistani influence in Afghanistan and the fear that it might be a strategic disadvantage to all of those 3 countries. Iran, as it looks around the world, does not necessarily find many countries that share its outlook on life or its language. And I guess in the last 20 years, what it's realized is that when it looks at Tajikistan in particular, it had to stop funding the Islamist insurgents and begin to forge a relationship. In 2006, Ahmadinejad went as far as to say Iran and Tajikistan were one spirit in 2 countries. One spirit in 2 bodies, a theological statement. They've had Persian summits 4 times in the last 4 years. Iran's invested around over $200 million of aid in Tajikistan. There is $250 million worth of trade last year. Iran is taking 11% of Tajikistan's exports. It had to intervene in June this year in order to persuade the Uzbeks to allow those exports to pass through Uzbek territory, because Tajikistan's railways, designed of course under the Soviet Union, are mainly controlled by Uzbekistan. Tajikistan has a very clear interest in forging a direct relationship with Iran, and both countries intend, among a whole series of agreements they have signed this year, to construct a railway across from Iran to Tajikistan. Now, that may sound like a rather grandiose project, but what it undoubtedly reflects is Iran's desire to have a trade route to China, which would pass through Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and out through what at the moment is the rather limited facilities of the Kulma Pass. And it's prepared, allegedly, to invest $2 billion in such a project. India, of course, has an airbase in Tajikistan as well, and it is notable that the interests of Iran and India, to some extent, do coincide in Afghanistan. Now, I want to highlight this. It obviously raises certain issues. I should mention that Tajikistan claims to have 11% of the world's supply of uranium. It does raise issues of concern for America, but I would say, on the whole, this investment is something that should be encouraged. What it means is that you do indeed have two axes to an extent. You have Iran and India and Russia. You have China and Pakistan. And both of those groups of countries may have an interest in the stability of Afghanistan. Now, I'm not necessarily going to base this on an optimistic view of what Afghanistan will look like. If I could be allowed one more light-hearted moment, I think if we are to look at a possible future for Afghanistan in the event that counterinsurgency does not succeed and that reconciliation does not happen in any formal sense, then there is a situation known to you all, perhaps in a different context, a military doctrine of a different sort. Don't ask, don't tell. And I'd like to suggest that what you may find is a whole network of covert and tacit agreements made by different Afghan political actors on the ground, that to some extent, in some places where the US Army withdraws and transitions to Afghan control, what you may find is what is already happening in Ghazni and Paktika and other places, that the reality will be that although there may be a district official turning up to his office every day, he does so by permission of the Taliban. And such a situation is not at all desirable, but I believe it's possible that a network of such local actors, including the Taliban, who may operate, perhaps acknowledging in some vague sense the existence of a government in Kabul, but in reality the government in Kabul will not ask too many questions and these local power brokers will not push themselves forward too far, that it's conceivable that with the support of regional players, with their encouragement, with the money that they've put into Afghanistan, with their need for the resources that Afghanistan can offer, the possibility that this regional equation could for a change work for the stability of Afghanistan.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take questions from the audience. Can you identify yourself, your affiliation, if you ask a question? Stunned into submission. In that case, I'll ask a question to Masood or to Jared, perhaps. I mean, the Chinese calculation, I think you indicated, Masood, that they maybe suddenly realize that they're not getting the bang for the buck that they were hoping in Pakistan. The sense that the Pakistani military no longer controls the militant groups, which is their principal concern. Did the Red Mosque incident where the Chinese massage employees were kidnapped, I mean, was that the fulcrum point where Chinese decision makers may have decided that they needed to be a little more skeptical about the Pakistani military and government's ability to control these groups? Or when did this skepticism start, do you think?
Yeah, a great question. I think that the issue is broader than that, but obviously the Red Mosque was a turning point without any doubt, because the Chinese intervene, unlike what they usually do, directly on this and practically ask the authorities to intervene directly in the Red Mosque incident, as far as I understand it, which is atypical of what the Chinese have been doing for decades and decades. They have invested in Pakistan, but have really almost never intervened in that forceful manner. And again, they did this with the Mumbai attack because they're concerned about it. But I think that the change is related to much broader aspects and greater forces that are going to be much difficult for China to handle. One was this fact that you can no longer keep the Uyghur area completely isolated in the way that China has done it before. The other aspect of it is that China realizes that the investments that it's making in Pakistan, when somebody was in control, total control, is no longer the case, and that there are forces within Pakistan, extremist groups within Pakistan, that are not in control of an entity such as the army. So China is really recalculating, in my view, that dynamic. If that is the case, that changes the balances of power, and there's an opportunity for the U.S. to find a mechanism to discuss these issues with China under a broader umbrella.
Question for Steve or Jared. To what extent of the recent sort of reflorescence of the Kashmiri sort of revolt or intifada, as they, does that change some of the things that we've been talking about today? I mean, is this just a sort of regular outgrowth of Kashmiri independence movements that we've seen before, or is it something different, something less controllable, something that might have a larger impact than the previous kinds of mini revolts we've seen in the past?
Well, it certainly was an important summer because the revolt, as you suggest, was more indigenous than not, and the momentum apart from Indo-Pakistani dialogue that had been developing between the Delhi administration and the opposition in Kashmir was disrupted. The political leaders in Kashmir lost control of their own constituency, risked being discredited if they didn't stand with the suffering that ensued after the shooting of unarmed demonstrators and so forth. You know, I think in the bigger picture, the Kashmir conflict as a source of obstacle to a settlement, normalization, if not a full-blown settlement, but a pathway to normalization of economic and political, cultural, and people-to-people contacts between India and Pakistan, has in effect already been resolved between the two states. It's comparable to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for those who believe in a two-state solution, in the sense that the outlines of the solution have been sketched. What's missing is not the engineering diagrams. What's missing is the political will, and the political conditions in which the will that exists can be brought into being in the form of an agreement. I don't think that's changed over the course of the summer.
Just one note, Peter, not answering your question directly, but it's worth noting that China got involved this year in the Kashmir dispute by refusing a visa for an Indian Kashmir official. And some interpreted that as a response to India's closer relationship with the US. China claims a part of Kashmir as well, so in theory it's a party to the dispute.
Great. Tom Lynch, NDU.
Yeah, Peter, thank you. I wanted to address a question, if I could, to all members of the panel, because you're all, of course, alluding to the grander strategic perspective and therefore alternate perspectives and futures for involvements of the players in the region. And I'd like to pose this question by reference to a couple of writers early in the year. First, Thomas Barfield, who, of course, discussed, as I think our speaker mentioned, the possibilities of a more northern-framed alliance. And, of course, you alluded to some of that between Iran. Likewise, there's been writing by Sig Harrison and others concerning the pernicious effect of the possibility of long-term U.S. military basing in Afghanistan to different combinations and futures. So I'd like to seek out the panel, each of you, your perspective on what a proper trajectory is for U.S. and coalition presence in Afghanistan against desirable outcomes for stability within Afghanistan, and then a trajectory that's more positive and positive sum game oriented for South Asia. Thank you.
I suppose all possibilities are subject to criticism and doubt and risk. My preference would be to see a US, a sustainable and therefore small-scale and politically unprovocative American military presence in Afghanistan, because without it, I don't think counterterrorism operations could be as effective, because the embassy, if there is one, will need protection. And therefore, I think the government in Kabul ultimately would be wanting some kind of guarantee. And I don't think that needs to mean fighting in the streets of Kandahar or Panjwai. I think it can be very simply limited to a largely air-based deterrent in support of the Afghan forces and to be used in the event of that the Taliban advance on Kabul. I think there are many different options and all of them have problems. What I fear is the risk of the present one is simply that the political will not continue to exist to maintain the very high level of US forces and casualties in the absence of apparent progress.
think it's an important question, one I'd want to give more thought to, but I think I'd end up where Gerard is by the opposite pathway. In other words, if the objective of American deployments and transition strategy now is to gradually withdraw from direct combat in support of credible Afghan security forces loyal to a sustainable, constitutionally organized Afghan government, and as that withdrawal occurs, to reduce the total number of American troops and NATO troops in the country without precipitating a civil war or a second Taliban revolution in some meaningful sense of revolution, then the end that you're working toward is something like what Gerard describes, in which the maximum amount of space that you're willing to yield is something in his kind of don't ask, don't tell sort of formulation in some rural areas, but where you are in support of the Afghan government's pursuit of a continuous monopoly on air power, intelligence collection, and other sources of military dominance without having to deliver the provocative rural patrolling that, is obviously not sustainable for 10 or 20 years, maybe not even for 5 years in either an Afghan or an American context.
The only thing that I would add is that obviously with U.S. troops in Afghanistan, we're really chasing the wrong target. And this notion that eventually the transfer part of this is the exit strategy is to me close to ludicrous. Building the Afghan national security forces does not make any sense to me in terms of an end goal. To get to the 300,000, 400,000, if we do, it's going to cost $3 to $4 billion to maintain an army of that size. We don't have it. The entire national revenues in Afghanistan is $1 billion. I know something about it. I used to work on it. And there's no way that the U.S. will be supporting the next 10, 20 years $4 billion. Congress is not going to do this, and the international community is not going to support it. So the math doesn't work, let alone the fact that even if the army is built, we have another large army next to another large army in Pakistan that can't be really a good formula. And an army of that size, without an esprit de corps, without an attachment to governance and a real state, doesn't make sense. So none of these goals have an endpoint that make any sense at all. I would agree with Steve that a gradual withdrawal is really the way to go, and then devise a strategy that is a long-term, as a 5-year strategy, maybe a 10-year strategy to look into the process.
Final question from the British Embassy. You can just, I can repeat it.
Okay, that's fine. If I could just go back to China actually briefly, and the panel mentioned the INAC copper mine a couple of times. Going forward then, I mean, what expectation do we have that China will develop that resource and perhaps some of the other ones that are emerging in Afghanistan in a responsible way that's for the benefit of Afghanistan and not just for the benefit of China, as we perhaps seen in some of their sort of similar projects in Africa?
Jared?
I think it's a great question, Richard. He's a real British diplomat, I should say. Keen to make clear that I'm not. Pretty limited. I think the one benefit that we know will accrue to Afghanistan is that China will have an interest in protecting that area from civil war and anarchy, which doesn't mean that it would be that bothered if the Taliban were running it. And that they have made an undertaking to employ a very large number of local people. But as you point out, in other projects elsewhere, it's been deeply problematic environmentally and in terms of its social impact.
For China to work on the INAC copper mine in Afghanistan, they're not doing that for Afghanistan. China typically in the past, whether it's in Africa and other areas in the recent 10 years or so, have undertaken this sort of large, extremely significant projects in other countries, not necessarily in regards to what would be the local benefit, is their benefit that's important, their interest. It happens that if it's better managed, obviously it would be a better outcome to establish stability. And my contention was that without the role of the U.S. in terms of sort of leadership and devising a framework for development for Afghanistan under a UN type of sanction, this kind of development is not going to lead to stability.
Well, on that optimistic note, thank you very much to the panel.